Congratulations. You've just woken up in Francia in the year 567. The good news? You're not a slave. Probably. The bad news? You're still living in the crumbling leftovers of the Roman Empire, and personal hygiene is optional at best. Your home is likely a drafty, wooden hut with a thatched roof that leaks when it rains, which is often. There's no running water indoors, no toilets, just buckets and the nearest ditch. Forget central heating. You're relying on a smoky fire pit in the middle of the floor, sharing the warmth with your family and whatever livestock you keep indoors. The smell? Let's just say scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they had, they couldn't compete with the aroma of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and whatever's fermenting in the corner. Your bed is a straw mattress teeming with unwelcome tiny guests that make sleep an itchy nightmare. But hey, at least you're not dealing with the headaches of royalty. Speaking of royalty, let's talk about the Franks. These were the folks who moved into the former Roman territory of Gaul. The Romans used to think they were terrifying monsters with wild hair and throwing axes. But honestly, after a few centuries, the Franks decided they liked Roman stuff. A lot. They wanted the fancy buildings, the paved roads, even if they were falling apart, and definitely the prestige. At this particular moment, in 567, the Frankish lands were ruled by 4 brothers, sons of a guy named Clothar, who had managed to reunite the kingdom for a hot minute before dropping dead and dividing it up again like a messy inheritance. These brothers? Not exactly the Brady Bunch. They were constantly squabbling, trying to grab each other's territory. There was Cheribert, the oldest, who ruled from Paris and had a truly wild love life that shocked even the less than shockable Franks. Then there was Guntram, the crafty middle child, ruling from Burgundy. And finally, the 2 youngest, Sigebert in Austrasia, the eastern part, and Chilperic in Neustria, the western part, who pretty much hated each other's guts and were constantly at war. Now, Sigebert, our guy in Austrasia, decided he needed to level up. His brothers were marrying local women, sometimes even their own servants. Gasp. But Sigebert? He wanted prestige. He wanted power. He wanted a bride who screamed, "I am important." So, he looked south, to Spain, where the Visigoths ruled. Their king, Athanagild, had 2 daughters, famous for their beauty and royal blood. Sigebert set his sights on the younger one, Princess Brunhild. Imagine this, a princess from sunny, Roman-influenced Spain, where cities still had baths and paved streets, about to marry into the rough-and-tumble world of the Franks. Brunhild was around 18, reportedly beautiful, smart, and educated. She'd grown up seeing her mother, Queen Goiswintha, wield real political influence, and she was ready to be more than just a pretty face on the throne. Sigebert's court in Metz was trying its best to look fancy for the occasion. His palace was a repurposed Roman building, probably still a bit dusty around the edges. They rolled out the red carpets, or at least the thickest rugs they had, hung tapestries to hide the crumbling walls, and even hired a poet named Venantius Fortunatus to write a flattering poem for the wedding. Fortunatus was a bit of a newcomer, trying to make a name for himself in the Frankish world, which, bizarrely, was obsessed with all things Roman. He probably sweat through his tunic as he stood there, trying to remember his lines about Cupid and Venus for an audience that probably still worshiped Thor. But hey, a gig was a gig, and a good performance could make his career. Brunhild arrived with a wagon train overflowing with treasure: gold, silver, jewels, fine clothes. She was escorted by Sigebert's right-hand man, a young, ambitious guy named Gogo. As she walked into the hall, everyone stared. Was she just another piece of treasure, or something more? Later, they'd learn the answer was definitely something more. Sigebert, at 32, was reportedly handsome and a skilled warrior. He was genuinely pleased with his bride. This wasn't just a love match, though. This was a power play. By marrying a foreign princess with serious connections, Sigebert was sending a clear message to his brothers. He was the one aiming for greatness, for a kingdom that echoed the glory of Rome. This did not go over well, especially with Chilperic. He was the youngest brother, constantly feeling overlooked and shortchanged. While Sigebert was making a splash with a foreign princess, Chilperic was, well, involved with a slave girl at his court. This wasn't uncommon. Frankish kings often had multiple relationships, sometimes even marrying servants. It was a way to produce heirs without getting tangled up with powerful noble families. But Chilperic, he was besotted with this girl, Fredegund. Fredegund had climbed her way up from kitchen slave to a trusted servant of Chilperic's first wife, Queen Audovera. Now, she was the king's favorite, maybe even his unofficial wife. It took serious smarts and a ruthless streak to pull that off in this world. She was born during a truly awful time. The mid-6th century was hit by volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun and brought famine, followed by the bubonic plague, which swept through Europe like a scythe. It was a time of death and upheaval, but also of opportunity for those cunning enough to seize it. Fredegund was definitely one of the cunning ones. Chilperic was so smitten with Fredegund that he'd already sent his perfectly respectable first wife, Audovera, off to a convent. Now, hearing about Sigebert's prestigious marriage, he was furious. He saw it as a direct challenge. But Fredegund, watching from the sidelines, was probably just calculating. She saw how the king reacted to everything, how his mood shifted. She knew that her position, despite the king's infatuation, was precarious. She was a slave, worth less than a cow in the eyes of the law. But she had survived worse, and she was ambitious. For now, she watched and waited. Meanwhile, in Paris, the eldest brother, Charibert, was having problems of his own. His latest wife was a teenage shepherdess named Thudachild, and while she'd just given him a longed-for son, the baby died almost immediately. Charibert, getting on in years, and still without a living heir, promptly married again. And this time, he married a nun. Now, marrying a nun was a huge no-no in the eyes of the church, and the Frankish church, though still pretty young and fragile, was trying to lay down the law. They were already struggling with priests who refused to stop sleeping with their wives and people who still liked worshipping trees. Charibert's scandalous marriage was a direct challenge. Things got even worse for Charibert. An epidemic hit Paris, and the bishops were quick to blame the king's sinful behavior. 9 of his bishops planned a meeting to confront him. Charibert, either clueless or arrogant, let them. It did not go well. They begged him to leave the nun. He flatly refused. And for that, he became the first Frankish king to be excommunicated. Talk about bad press. Stunned, and now a pariah, Charibert retreated to a villa outside Bordeaux. He went hunting to clear his head, and conveniently dropped dead, likely of a heart attack. What do you do with an excommunicated king's body? You can't bury him in sacred ground, not alongside his famous grandfather, Clovis. So, they carted him off to an old Roman fort and buried him like a pagan. Not exactly the send-off a king who saw himself as the heir to Roman glory would have wanted. Back in Metz, Brunhild and Sigebert weren't shedding too many tears for Charibert. They were too busy figuring out how his death affected them. 4 kingdoms were now 3. Who would get the best pieces of the pie? And what about Charibert's considerable wealth? Enter Theudechild, the shepherdess queen. Cast aside for a nun, she now saw her chance. The nun was dead, her marriage invalid in the church's eyes. Theudechild, as the briefly mother of the king's son, could claim to be the rightful widow. And as a royal widow, she had access to the treasury. Frankish queens couldn't command armies, but they could hand out gifts, coins to a bishop, jewels to a noble, to build alliances. Theudechild had bigger plans. She loaded up all of Charibert's gold and jewels onto carts. She must have had help from some bribed guards and servants. She stashed the treasure and then, channeling her inner Roman empress, proposed marriage to the next eldest brother, Guntram. Guntram, ever the crafty one, saw an opportunity. He told her to come, bring her treasure, and he'd give her an honorable place. Theudechild, hopeful, rode south with the goods. Guntram welcomed her, took the treasure, laughed in her face, called her unworthy, and then, just like Chilperic had done with Audovera, packed her off to a nunnery in Arles. He then married one of his own ex-wife's former slaves. So much for honor. For Brunhild, watching this unfold from Metz, there was a harsh lesson. Playing politics was dangerous for queens. Men hoarded power and would crush a woman's ambition without a second thought. And Theudechild's story ended even worse. She tried to escape the convent with a Visigoth, was caught, and beaten mercilessly, left to suffer until she died. It was a grim preview of the world Brunhild was navigating, but unlike Theudechild, Brunhild had powerful family connections, ambition, and a keen mind, and she was about to prove that she wouldn't be so easily cast aside. In the months after her wedding, Brunhild was settling into life in Metz. It wasn't Toledo, but it was prosperous, surrounded by pleasant countryside. The view from her palace window included an old Roman amphitheater, where instead of gladiators, they now had bear baiting. Charming. She found the Frankish court a bit rustic. They liked loud national epics instead of sophisticated poetry. She had admirers, but few companions. Her Latin was excellent, but most nobles spoke a deformed version, or Frankish. She missed her mother and sister. The poet, Fortunatus, still hanging around after the wedding, hoping for more work, was a welcome distraction. He matched her education and entertained her with tales of his travels. But soon, Fortunatus was off again, this time to Paris, hired by the recently excommunicated Charibert. Charibert, nearing 50 and heirless, was trying to salvage his image with a grand ceremony and a flattering poem. Fortunatus, ever the opportunist, delivered, praising Charibert as a most excellent king and comparing him to the conquering emperor Trajan. He even sucked up to the clergy, calling Charibert pious and mature. It was a masterclass in flattery, especially since Charibert's scandal was still fresh. But the bishops weren't fooled. The church was fighting for its place in this chaotic world. They were trying to enforce rules against incest and married priests, and Charibert's public defiance was unacceptable. When the epidemic hit Paris, the bishops saw it as divine judgment. They finally excommunicated him. Cheribert's death left his kingdom open for the taking. His brothers, Sigebert, Guntram, and Chilperic, immediately started squabbling over it. Gundevald, Sigebert's illegitimate half-brother, who'd been living at Cheribert's court and was rumored to be his heir, was quickly hustled away and had his hair cut. The Frankish way of saying, "You're out of the running for the throne." Brunhild, meanwhile, got pregnant. This was great news. A male heir would solidify her position. She probably felt a pang of sympathy for Gundevald, another outsider like her, now sidelined. But the baby was a girl, another potential heir for the Frankish world, but not the son Brunhild needed to feel truly secure. Still, the division of Cheribert's lands went ahead in early 568. Paris, the old capital, was declared neutral territory, to be shared. The rest was carved up. Chilperic, always feeling cheated, got the smallest share, a patchwork kingdom in the north and southwest. This left him furious, especially since Sigebert got strategically important cities like Tours and Poitiers right in the middle of Chilperic's new lands. Chilperic, ever the hothead, immediately invaded Tours and Poitiers, breaking the fragile peace. His army was led by his eldest son, Theudebert, the very boy Sigebert had spared years earlier, after another of Chilperic's failed invasions. This forced Theudebert to break his oath to his uncle, a major no-no in this honor-bound society. But Chilperic's attack failed again. He was boxed in, surrounded by his brothers, and, in the south, by Brunhild's people, the Visigoths. Chilperic needed a new strategy. He needed a prestigious alliance to match Sigebert's, and who better than Brunhild's own sister, Galswintha? King Athanagild of Spain wouldn't have considered Chilperic before, but now Chilperic had land next to Spain, and he made an offer no one could refuse. He would give Galswintha a massive mourning gift, not just jewels or a villa, but the entire southern third of his kingdom, 5 wealthy cities in the Aquitaine. This was unheard of. Chilperic was risking everything, but he wanted this alliance, and he wanted to outdo Sigebert. Athanagild agreed, but with a condition. Galswintha would convert to Catholicism, but Chilperic had to swear a solemn oath to abandon all other women. Everyone knew this meant Fredegund. Chilperic, eager for the alliance, agreed. Fredegund, the slave girl, was to be sent away. But Fredegund wasn't about to disappear quietly. She kept her own counsel, and she waited. While Chilperic was scrambling for a new bride, Sigebert was basking in the glow of his successful marriage and the birth of his daughter, Ingund. He was building churches, repairing infrastructure in Metz, trying to project an image of a wise, Roman-style ruler. He was also securing his borders, making alliances. He'd already dealt with the Avars in the east and the Saxons in the north. Now, he looked south to Italy, controlled by the Lombards, and, beyond them, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, ruling from Constantinople, still saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, and were trying to reclaim Italy. Sigebert wanted to befriend the new Byzantine emperor, Justin II, who was reportedly kind of erratic, and whose wife, Sophia, was the real power behind the throne. To approach the Byzantines subtly, Sigebert turned to an unlikely figure, his father's fourth wife, Radgund. Radgund was a Thuringian princess, captured as a child, forced into marriage with King Clothar, but who had found her escape in fierce piety. She refused to sleep with the king, starved herself, wore hair shirts, even branded herself. Finally, after Clothar murdered her baby brother, she left him entirely and became a nun. Radegund was no ordinary nun. She established one of the first convents for women in Francia, Holy Cross Abbey in Poitiers. From there, she became a major political and religious figure, welcoming dignitaries and corresponding with foreign rulers, including the Byzantines. So, Sigebert and Brunhild sent emissaries to Radegund, including the poet Fortunatus. Their plan: use Radegund's religious connections to open a channel to Byzantium. Radegund wanted a piece of the True Cross, a highly prized relic held in Constantinople. She sent her own messengers with a powerful poem, seemingly a personal account of the Frankish invasion that destroyed her homeland, but also a subtle warning to the Byzantines. The Franks are brutal, but they listen to me. It was a brilliant diplomatic move. The response came from Empress Sophia. She sent the relic, solidifying a connection with Radegund and, through her, Brunhild. Soon after, Sigebert sent his own embassy, formalizing an alliance with Byzantium. This alliance also created a bond between Brunhild and Radegund. Brunhild, still lonely at court, found a friend in the influential abbess. Radegund even welcomed Brunhild's sister, Galsvintha, when she arrived in Frankish lands for her wedding to Chilperic in July 568. Fortunatus noted their close exchanges, with Radegund offering motherly love. Galsvintha's arrival in Rouen was a spectacle. Chilperic, trying desperately to match Sigebert's prestige, met her with his entire army kneeling. The wedding was in the cathedral, not a repurposed building. Galsvintha came with even more treasure than Brunhild. But less than 6 months later, tragedy struck. Galsvintha caught Chilperic in bed with Fredegund, despite his oath. She was furious, humiliated. She demanded to return home, even if it meant leaving her enormous dowry. Then, one morning, Galsvintha was found dead in her bed, strangled. 3 days later, dressed in Galsvintha's jewels, Fredegund married Chilperic in a quick ceremony at a royal villa. The Frankish world was shocked. Gregory of Tours, the bishop who would chronicle this era, stated plainly what everyone suspected. Chilperic had ordered Galsvintha's murder. Later art would even portray Chilperic himself doing the deed, sometimes with Fredegund watching. Fredegund's origins were murky. She was a slave, and the historical record is silent on her family. This fueled rumors and suspicion. How did a slave gain such power? Some whispered witchcraft. A later story claimed she'd tricked Chilperic's first wife using obscure church law, but that tale wasn't true at the time. Still, it shows Fredegund had a reputation for being clever, maybe even literate, unusual for a slave. She hadn't thrown a fit when Galsvintha arrived. She'd waited. Now she was queen, but her position was shaky. Chilperic had other heirs, sons from his first marriage. Fredegund had to produce children, hopefully sons, to secure her future. Lying in the bed where Galsvintha had died, Fredegund must have felt the weight of it all. Fortunatus, hearing the news, wrote about the 2 towers from Toledo, one broken. Brunhild was devastated. In less than 2 years, she'd lost her homeland, her father, and now her only sister, likely murdered by her own husband. She was alone in a foreign land with a language barrier. Frankish law, the Lex Salica, had surprisingly high values for women, especially those of childbearing age. A free woman was worth as much as an aristocrat, even more if pregnant. A queen's worth was incalculable. But who had the power to enforce justice for Galsvintha? Brunhild knew she couldn't just grieve. She needed political power. She needed allies. The nobles at Sigebert's court were divided into factions. One wanted closer ties with Byzantium, another with Chilperic, a third with Guntram. Brunhild, understandably, leaned towards the anti-Chilperic group, led by her old escort, Gogo. Gogo, a young, ambitious count who'd risen through the ranks, saw an opportunity in Galswintha's death. This was a perfect excuse for a war with Neustria, to avenge their queen's sister and seize valuable land, Galswintha's Morgengabe. Gogo, along with Roman-leaning allies like the poet and Governor Dynamius and the warrior Duke Wolf, started building their case. Their main opposition was Bishop Aegidius of Reims, a powerful figure who favored peace with Neustria, partly because his family had land disputes with the Wolfs in the Champagne region. Aegidius and his allies also included traditionalist Franks who disliked Roman influence and foreign queens. Then there was Duke Guntram Boso. This guy was a legendary warrior, fearless and unpredictable, driven by self-interest. He led the pro-Byzantine faction, but really, he was pro-Boso. He was easily swayed by the promise of plunder and glory. Gogo's faction knew they needed Boso on their side. A war with Neustria offered plenty of action. Boso, despite his volatile nature, agreed not to oppose them. The plan, a propaganda campaign. Fortunatus was commissioned to write an elegy for Galswintha. It wasn't just a poem of mourning. It was a political weapon. It painted Galswintha as a saintly victim and highlighted the outrage in Spain, reminding the Franks that Chilperic's actions could lead to a Visigothic invasion. Then, in 570, the timing was perfect. Brunhild gave birth to a son on Easter morning, a good omen. He was named Chilbert, after Sigebert's famous uncle. This secured the succession in Austrasia and strengthened the alliance with Guntram, who was now convinced that any lands recovered from Chilperic would stay in Frankish hands through Brunhild's son. King Guntram, as the eldest brother, presided over a court convened to try Chilperic for Galswintha's murder. Chilperic, not surprisingly, didn't show up and was convicted in absentia. The verdict gave Sigebert and Guntram the pretext they needed to invade Neustria, starting with Galswintha's Morgengabe, but aiming to take Chilperic's entire kingdom. The war was on. Sigebert and Guntram's armies, now united, rolled through Neustrian territory. The cities of Galswintha's dowry surrendered quickly. Things were going so well, Guntram, in a moment of typical indecisiveness, almost backed out, worried that a too powerful Sigebert would come after his kingdom next. But Sigebert, showing his daring side, recruited pagan Germanic troops from his vassal kingdoms, essentially creating a mercenary army. Faced with this unruly force on his border, Guntram rejoined the fight. Chilperic was losing. He fled his capital, Soissons, with Fredegund and their children. Fredegund had given birth to a daughter, Raigund, and in 570, a son, Clodebert. Her position was more secure as the mother of an heir, but still precarious. As the war intensified, Fredegund's son's prospects improved in the most brutal way possible. Chilperic's eldest son, Thedebert, leading a doomed defense, was killed by Duke Guntram Boso. Now only 2 of Chilperic's sons from his first marriage remained, and they were also in the thick of the fighting. Fredegund was pregnant again, hoping for another son, an heir and a spare. Sigebert and his army, joined by the formidable Duke Boso, were pushing north. Messengers were sent to bring Brunhild and the children to Paris for a triumphant entry. Bishop Germanus of Paris, fearing the city would be destroyed, wrote to Brunhild directly, calling her most excellent queen and begging her to spare Paris. This was a clear sign of her growing influence. Brunhild had also used her influence to get her ally, Gregory, appointed Bishop of Tours, an important and wealthy city. Gregory, despite his snobbery, owed Brunhild a favor. Tours now fell under Chilperic's control, but everyone expected that to be temporary. Chilperic and his family were holed up in Tournai, under siege. Fredegund was in labor. She gave birth to another boy, but was overcome by a fear of death, and initially refused to hold or baptize him. Chilperic, shaken from his stupor, intervened, forcing the baptism. The baby was given the strange, un-Frankish name, Samson. News reached Sigebert that the nobles in Chilperic's northern territories were ready to defect and declare him king of all Neustria. Sigebert rode out to accept their offer, leaving Paris to join the siege of Tournai and finish off his brother. But Fredegund, even in her weakened state, wasn't done. She called for 2 slave boys and, in a bold and unprecedented move, gave them poison daggers and sent them to assassinate Sigebert during his inauguration celebration at Vitry-en-Artois. It was a suicide mission, but she promised their families rewards. The boys succeeded. They stabbed Sigebert, and within minutes, the magnificent victory was dead. Chilperic rushed to Vitry-en-Artois, saw his brother's body, and ordered a proper burial. The siege was over. They could return to their palace. Sigebert's assassination broke the rules of warfare. It was seen as cowardly, underhanded, and the rumors of Fredegund's involvement, of her using poison, a word linked to witchcraft, solidified her reputation as a ruthless, maybe even magical figure. Gregory of Tours, ever biased, called her actions maleficati, witchcraft. The Franks believed in witches, even if they couldn't agree on dragons. Accusing someone of witchcraft was serious, far worse than calling a woman a whore. It was an attack on her very being. But Fredegund didn't seem to care. She preferred to be feared. As she returned to Soissons with Chilperic, she likely met the fearful gazes of the crowds with a smile. In the chaos after Sigebert's death, many who had defected to him rushed back to pledge loyalty to Chilperic. Some even joined them in executing Sigebert's attendants. The remaining Austrasians, stunned, retreated to Metz to regroup, leaving Brunhild and her children in Paris. Brunhild, now a widow for the second time, was trapped. She had her personal treasure, but not the royal treasury needed to buy loyalty. Her best chance was to keep her son, young Childebert, alive. 5-year-old boys were vulnerable, and Chilperic was marching towards Paris. Childebert had to be smuggled out. Accounts differ. Hidden in a basket, a cart, passed through a window, in a sack to a boat, on the Seine. Her daughters were also sent away, reaching safety just over the Austrasian border. Chilperic arrived in Paris, expecting to find Brunhild and her children, but found her alone. He seized her and her treasure, then sent men to find the children. They caught the daughters in Meaux, but missed Childebert. Chilperic, perhaps feeling magnanimous after surviving and regaining his kingdom, ordered Brunhild, kept alive, but sent to a convent in Rouen, under the care of Bishop Praetextatus. Her daughters were to remain hostages. Back in Metz, the Austrasian court was somber. A 5-year-old boy was crowned king, alarming warriors who expected an attack from Chilperic. Gogo, Brunhild's ally, became the boy's regent. his nutritor, the one who feeds the king. Brunhild found herself in the convent in Rouen, a place for widowed queens. Life there was austere. Rough robes, prayers at all hours, manual labor. She hated it. Her only way out was to marry again. Her mother, Goiswintha, had done it, marrying her dead husband's successor to keep her power. Meanwhile, Sigebert's half-brother, Gundevald, the one who'd had his hair cut, had escaped Byzantine custody and was now living in Constantinople. The Byzantines saw him as a potential puppet king if the Merovingian brothers kept killing each other off. With Sigebert dead and a child on the throne, Gundevald seemed like a good option for a new husband for Brunhild. He was a carbon copy of Sigebert, a Merovingian prince, and he had a rapport with Brunhild. But getting a bride out of a Neustrian convent was tricky. And Empress Sophia in Byzantium was dealing with her husband, Justin II's madness, barking and biting his chamberlains. A more immediate possibility for Brunhild's escape emerged closer to home. Chilperic's first wife, Audovera, was living in Rouen, possibly at the same convent as Brunhild. They had a lot in common: ousted queens, targeted by Fredegund. Audovera's sons were now threatened by Fredegund's living boy. Walking the convent gardens, a plan took shape: a marriage between Brunhild and Audovera's eldest surviving son, Merovech, who was leading Chilperic's army. This wasn't romance, it was rebellion. Merovech would depose his father, rule Neustria, and Brunhild would be queen again, her body the link between the two kingdoms. They would need help from the nuns, using the convent's back channels to communicate and plan. Merovech, sent by Chilperic to conquer territory, instead rode to Tours, where Brunhild's ally, Bishop Gregory, and Duke Boso, hiding from Chilperic, were. It's unclear who the messenger was. Gregory, the well-connected nun Ingratud living in the basilica courtyard, or even Boso himself, still looking for a way to gain favor. Regardless, Merovech got the message. Instead of going south as ordered, he marched his army north to Rouen to visit his mother. Brunhild's second wedding was a stark contrast to her first. Dressed in her finest, no longer in a nun's habit, she married Merovech in the cathedral in Rouen. The bishop, Praetextatus, Merovech's godfather, officiated, defying Chilperic and ignoring the church's incest prohibitions. The cathedral was empty, a quiet rebellion. Outside, Merovech's army waited. Messages slipped through networks of abbesses, priests, and farmers had orchestrated a coup. They had soldiers. Brunhild had the money. Her personal treasure, now under Praetextatus's care, used to bribe nobles. And they had the element of surprise. Their plan: assassinate Chilperic. If that failed, attack his capital, Soissons, from two sides: Merovech from the west, Duke Wulf from the east, with a man on the inside to open the gates. It was a solid plan, but Chilperic, getting wind of the marriage and potential plot, marched on Rouen sooner than expected. Merovech and Brunhild were trapped. They hunkered down inside the city walls, hoping for reinforcements. If the walls fell, they would seek sanctuary in a small chapel dedicated to Saint Martin, the patron saint of the Franks, built high on the city walls. They also decided to portray the marriage as a love-struck elopement, hoping Chilperic would be more lenient with a son blinded by passion than with a political rival. Chilperic arrived, and a standoff ensued. Eventually, a truce was called. Chilperic swore not to separate them if it was God's will. He met with them, shared a meal, seemingly accepting their story. But then news arrived. Wolfe's army was attacking Soissons. The attack failed, but it revealed the true scope of the rebellion. Chilperic realized his son, his wife,